I'm going to begin this presentation with a pair of predictions. And speaking as an historian, I would say this pair of predictions is unique in this sense. One of them I regard as the most remarkable prediction ever recorded. And the other one is the most important prediction that did not come true. And these two predictions will stand as sort of the two ends of this presentation as to why I think the predictions are important, but more to the point, why one of them came true and the other one did not. The first one is virtually unknown, and it was made by Ezra Styles. Stiles was the president of Yale University in the latter part of the 18th century. In 1783, about 6 months before the Treaty of Paris was signed, which made the United States an independent nation, he gave a sermon then called an election sermon, which these sermons were quite common for over a century in America. It is one of the longest sermons probably ever preached. I don't see how any of them got through it, if you want the truth. The printed version is something like 51 pages, and it reads like an unedited doctoral dissertation. But in the midst of this sermon, he said the following: "Already for ages, Europe has arrived to a plenary, if not declining, population of 100 millions. In 200 or 300 years, this second enlargement may cover America with 3 times that number if the present ratio of increase continues with the enterprising spirit of Americans for colonization and removing out into the wilderness and settling new countries." 200 years almost to the day, the United States population reached 300 million people. There's no prediction that I've ever seen in terms of accuracy, and more to the point, in terms of what would have been inconceivable at the time that the prediction was made, than Ezra Styles' sermon called "The United States Elevated to Glory and Honor." 15 years after this election sermon was delivered, another parson made a prediction. His prediction was much longer and much more important and much more conventional, was widely received, and shaped the thinking of virtually all Western scholars for the next 80 years. It was published anonymously, and only later, when the book in which the prediction appeared was widely accepted, did he come forward. His name was Thomas Robert Malthus, and the book was on population. In that book, he made an assessment of what was going to happen throughout the West. And that assessment was, very straightly and succinctly stated in a phrase that we all know, that food increases arithmetically, but population increases geometrically. Now, he took it out of later editions because it was clearly preposterous, because there's no reason why food wouldn't increase geometrically just along with any other population. So he took it out, but the implication was clear, and that is that population pressures would always push against the prevailing supply of food in any society, with any species, at any time in history. This was the most important single attack on the Enlightenment that was ever delivered. And it shook the Enlightenment, and it was self-conscious to shake the Enlightenment, because what he was doing was reacting against the optimism of Enlightenment philosophers with respect to the future, that Enlightenment and science would combine to create a society of endless growth and endless prosperity and upward movement. And Malthus sat down, anonymously at first, and wrote his book to show that this could not possibly be true, because population would always expand within the environment to the limitations of resources, but the main resource was food. And this shook the Enlightenment optimists, and they began to attempt to refute this from 1798 onward, that this was the great dark cloud that was brought over Enlightenment philosophy. And it led in economic circles to the doctrine known as the iron law of wages. And within 40 years, the idea began to percolate in the mind of a self-taught naturalist by the name of Charles Darwin. And Darwin took that doctrine and began to cogitate about it, because he believed that with this understanding of population, there would now be a scientific procedure, or as what we might call today a mechanism, which would explain how there could be variation in terms of progeny and the survival of certain progeny and not the survival of others, which would give competitive advantage within an environment that was hostile to the species as a whole, because each species would rapidly progress to expand its particular niche within the environment. And I think it is accurate to say that this is the only time that a work of social science ever directly shaped natural science in Western history, but it did shape it. And A.R. Wallace found the same idea and began working at the same time, and it was only when he finally contacted Darwin saying, "I've been thinking about this," and Darwin looked at it and said in his memoirs, "Even the chapter headings are the same as mine." And he conned Wallace into doing a joint article in a scholarly journal, and that article had the effect of virtually all scholarly journals. It sank without a trace. That was in 1858. And then Darwin forced by Wallace, published Origin of Species, which came out in late 1859 and clearly reshaped all of Western social thought and biological thought. Everything was reshaped by this idea. By this idea, this prophecy, I would call it, but certainly prediction of Malthus's, which became, I believe, the most important prediction of all time in terms of its influence and in terms of its error.